This is Plant Rama with C.L. Fornari and myself, Ellen Zakos. It's the podcast where there are no stupid questions, as long as the topic is plants. Today, we're going to talk about deciding which tropicals and annuals you might save through the winter, preserving the harvest, and how smart are those weeds really? But we're going to begin with a segment for the plant noob and talk about which tropicals or annuals that you've grown outdoors over the summer might be worth bringing indoors to save for the next season.
This time of year, Ellen, people often are looking at their containers and their window boxes, and they're thinking, oh, this looks so gorgeous. I can't let it freeze, right? Why don't I bring it in for the winter? And for some plants, that is absolutely the right thing to do. But for other things, maybe not.
Yeah, for some it is worthwhile. And for others, it's a lot of work and doesn't really pay off very well. And I'm going to say that one of the ones that I find is not worthwhile, and I think it's a plant that people are tempted to overwinter because it's so beautiful, is Brugmansia. They can be expensive, they're gorgeous, and if you do overwinter them, they just get bigger and bigger and better every year. But it is so hard to keep them spider mite free in an indoor environment. For me, it has been, if you want to keep them blooming. Now, if you can overwinter them dormant, that might help because the cold temperatures would get rid of those spider mites. But if you think, oh, I'm going to keep this beautiful Brugmansia in my sunroom over the winter, please be aware that spider mites can be a real problem with this plant indoors, and it will no longer be the beautiful thing that it was for you outdoors.
Well, I overwintered Angel's Trumpet, another name for this plant, about 4 or 5, maybe even 6 years in a row. But I was fortunate, Ellen, in that I didn't have to bring it inside. I could have it in my unheated garage.
Perfect.
Where it doesn't go much below 40, 38 degrees. So the plant would lose all of its leaves. It would look like a Brugmansia pretty pathetica, a bare stem. I would wonder if it would even be alive, and then I would pull that bare stem, which got to be 6-7 feet tall. I would pull it outside in May and start to water it again, and lo and behold, I think because the stem is so thick, it had so many carbohydrates stored in that stem, so much energy, that it was able to leaf out, to produce roots again, and flower for me toward the end of the summer. But I agree with you. I would never bring it in the house.
Now, I have to ask you, you said, you keep talking about the stem, and you said grow roots again. Did you not overwinter it in the garage? And by the way, I envy you because that is the perfect way to do it. Did you pull it out of the soil and overwinter it bare-rooted? No. Okay, so it was in the soil.
It was in the soil, but I didn't water it.
So the roots could easily have survived.
I didn't water it all winter, and so as a result, it definitely had a reduced root system, right, by the end of the winter time. But it came back beautifully. I know people who've done the same thing by putting the plant in a basement and completely leafless, no light, no water, just let that stem stay in that pot, stay in the dirt. I think it might die if you took it out of the dirt and just had a bare stem sitting around.
I think it would, yeah. But what you just described works so well for so many of our favorite tropicals, and especially a lot of the tropicals that get bigger and better with time, and so you want to overwinter them because you want that Alocasia leaf to be taller than your head. You want those cannas to come back bigger and better every year. And with the setup that you described, that's very possible to do. But not all of us have that. And we still don't want to give up all those beautiful plants. And there are some annuals and tropicals that you can overwinter as houseplants indoors.
One group of plants that I would say to somebody new to plants and gardens that are worth it are the succulents.
Yes.
Bringing them inside, first of all, most of them get bigger and more magnificent and impressive every year, so worth it for that reason. They don't require a lot of your attention during the winter. It's not that you have to water them that frequently. And they only require a sunny window, so not prone to pests particularly, most of them. So those I think are worth overwintering.
Which succulents are you thinking?
I do it with several of the euphorbias, whether it's the sticks of fire or the Madagascar jewel. I do it with those. I have a barrel cactus, several agaves that every year get bigger and more wonderful. In fact, one I have to put on a suit of armor and step it up in a pot pretty soon because it's going to burst its clay pot if I don't. So all of those I think are worth it for me.
Good.
And the other criteria that I use, Ellen, is this plant easily purchased in the spring?
Exactly.
Because if I know I can buy a new mandevilla vine, I'm not going to jump through the hoops to save the one from year to year, unless it's a special one that, I can't normally find, like those apricot colors.
Yeah. Well, that's it. Exactly. If it was hard for you to find, for example, if you've got a strobilanthes, that purple-leafed Persian shield growing like gangbusters in a summer container, and you had a hard time locating it, you might want to save that and grow that as a houseplant. Same goes for your very favorite coleus, maybe that you grew from seed and you can't find the seed and you can't find the plant. Take cuttings of that coleus. It will grow for you indoors. It may not be as wonderful as it was outdoors, but you will have success with that. So anything that was tough to locate, consider overwintering as a houseplant.
And if it's a common annual, those petunias, those marigolds.
Not worth it, no.
Sometimes I say to people, if it's hard frost as predicted and you want to bring that container in and enjoy it for a couple of days inside, and then maybe you'll have a nice warm period again and you can put it back outside. So by all means, do that. But know that those common annuals are more prone to insects, not just the Brugmansia, but they're all more prone to insects. So is it worth it for the common things? Not for me.
I will tell you there's one plant that might be considered common by some. It's a giant genus, actually, not one plant, that I can never resist overwintering, and that is the begonias. A begonia, when it's in its prime, is just irresistible to me. I don't care whether it's a Rex begonia or an angel wing begonia. I have a really hard time putting those on the compost pile, and I will almost always overwinter a begonia indoors. And they are less pest prone for me than many of the others.
Me too. I save those begonias. And that's one reason why, is that they are not that prone to problems. Sometimes they die back a fair amount. But some of the varieties that I have, like my immense begonia, that actually comes into full and glorious flower all winter long indoors. Nice. So I get the pleasure of seeing their long, tall pink flowers and have them shed their pink flowers all over my bathroom floor.
So now is the time of year to look around your garden and think about what you might want to overwinter if you have the perfect dormancy space like CL does, or which plants you might be able to bring in and enjoy all winter long.
I know that many of our listeners, Ellen, are still harvesting from the garden. And if you're one of our listeners who are still blessed with that vegetable garden filled with produce, I am rejoicing with you because it's one of my favorite times a year. But we also end up with more than we can eat and particularly for my husband and myself, it's 2 people in the household. So we do give a lot of it away, right? We do share the wealth, but we also preserve. And so I thought we should talk about some of the easiest ways that people can keep these things from now, I should say, into the winter so that they can enjoy their garden all winter long on their dinner table.
Of course, easiest is best as far as I'm concerned. I mean, you also have to factor in how the flavor and the texture are preserved. And I want to start with something that most people at this time of year have a real abundance of, and that's zucchini. Now, I think you and I have different favorite methods for preserving zucchini, but zucchini is a vegetable that preserves wonderfully simply by dehydrating. So if you have a dehydrator, you can slice that zucchini up, put it in the dehydrator. You don't need to blanch it first. You don't need to salt it first. You don't need to do anything to it. Just put it in the dehydrator, dry it at about 135 degrees Fahrenheit until the chips are crisp, and put them in a jar and stick it on the shelf in a sealed jar, a tightly sealed jar. And they rehydrate wonderfully and have an excellent texture. And this doesn't work for all vegetables. I've tried it with eggplant, and eggplant never really rehydrates with a texture that satisfies me. But zucchini does. It's so easy, and it takes no space and no energy to store once you've done with the dehydration. So that's my number one recommendation.
Well, I don't have a dehydrator, but I do love roasting zucchini. Same thing, slice it, no oil, no salt, nothing. I put it on parchment paper on a cookie sheet. I bake them at about 375 degrees until they just start to color up on the edges, get a little bit caramelized. Cool them, I throw them in a plastic bag and put them in the freezer. So similar, but yes, I am using, the freezer energy for holding those. So I understand why you like dehydrating. Let's talk for a minute about some of the things that people can perhaps throw in their freezer raw, because there are some, plants that you can chop, put in a bag or a carton, and freeze without cooking them or dehydrating them at all. And I think tomatoes are probably the plant that most people do that. I know many people who just take whole tomatoes from their garden, put them in a bag, and put them in the freezer. And then when they go to use them, that's when they toss them in boiling water to blanch, pull off the skins, and go ahead and cook with them.
That is so funny, because I have never, ever once in my life done that with tomatoes. I mean, it sounds great, and I'm going to do it this year. It sounds so much easier. But usually I either, if I have small tomatoes, I cut them in half and I dry them and use them as sun-dried tomatoes, or I will just blanch, skin, and can them, because I have more shelf space than freezer space, even though I have a chest freezer. So I'll can them and save them that way. But my favorite thing to do, have you ever used Marcella Hazen's tomato sauce recipe, the onion and butter one?
I have not.
It could not be simpler, and it does not sound like the most delicious tomato sauce in the entire world. And yet it is. And every tomato I get, practically, I turn into that, and I can it, and I in March, when I'm exhausted and I don't want to make dinner, I pull it down from the shelf and I'm satisfied. So that's my go-to on tomatoes. But I love the idea that if I were overwhelmed with work, I could just freeze them now and then make the sauce later when I have more time.
Absolutely, and you can.
I didn't know you.
Yeah, and you can. The other vegetables that are very successfully frozen if chopped and put in bags are peppers, onions, and leeks. All of those are very successful done raw. You, of course, have to cook them immediately when you take them out. You can't thaw them and eat them without cooking. But you can chop those peppers and put them in a bag, and that way you can reach in for a small handful of peppers for any recipe that you need, right? And ditto with the onions and the leeks. Very successful.
All right, well, let's talk about a couple of preservation methods that might require a little more work from the gardener, okay? And that would be pickling and making jams, which are both great ways. Oh, and what about infusing booze? Infusing booze, that's another great way to preserve a fruit. And this time of year, I don't know what fruits are coming in. Apples, pears are going to be coming in soon.
Fall crop raspberries for many people.
Yeah. And raspberry jam is unbeatable when it's, homemade. Absolutely unbeatable. And it's really not that difficult to make. When you make jam, you don't need to add pectin. You're just cooking down the fruit and the sugar until it reaches the thickness that you desire. And if you're still getting cucumbers, why not make some dill pickles or some bread and butter pickles? You don't have to use a canner. You can make refrigerator pickles. They really aren't that hard.
They aren't that hard, and refrigerator pickles actually keep for a long time in
Yes.
the refrigerator.
They're
So
usually finished.
yeah.
You usually eat them before they go bad because they're so good.
That's right. Well, I'm looking forward to doing some bread and butter pickles this year, I think. I've done dill pickles, with garlic and dill and mustard seed, but I have never done bread and butter pickles, which have a little sugar in them.
Yeah.
And I think I would like to do that because part of the joy of leftovers after Thanksgiving for me is, believe it or not, a turkey sandwich with bread and butter pickles.
I think that sounds delicious, CL. I hope you do make your pickles.
Let's talk for a minute, Ellen, about canning, because you mentioned that in terms of tomatoes, right? And people can their pickles, right? So that they're sealed and they don't have to be in the refrigerator.
Right.
What else would you recommend people go to the trouble of canning?
Well, if you're not an experienced canner, you're probably going to want to start out just canning things that you can do in a boiling water bath, which means you don't need a pressure canner. You can do this in a large pasta pot. And to do that, you're really limited to things that either have a high acid value, like pickles, or a high sugar content like jams and jellies. So as you mentioned, a fall raspberry crop would be great. If you're still getting blackberries, that works really well. Applesauce is an excellent thing to can in a boiling water bath, and whether that's traditional apples that you're growing or getting from a farmer's market, or whether it's crab apples, do not dismiss the ubiquitous crab apple. Some of them are delicious, and I can them every year. Also, think about pickling fruit. Crab apples make wonderful pickles. A spiced crab apple served as a side dish with a pork chop or roast pork is magnificent and very easy to do. And like I said, does not require any special equipment.
Well, speaking of pickling, we love to pickle green beans. We love, and green beans, or even green beans and carrots. Most vegetables you can pickle, and that again makes it possible for you to use that boiling water bath because you have the high acid of the vinegar that keeps them good. And how about chutneys? Do you do chutney?
I do chutneys, and I love chutneys. I especially love peach chutney, and I know it's a little late in the year to be harvesting peaches, but I find peach and apricot chutney with raisins and onions to be absolutely delicious. And of course, living in New Mexico, I always add a little spicy chili to them as well. And that's another thing that, because of the vinegar content, you can just preserve in a boiling water bath, and it's going to be shelf stable after that.
Yeah. I love to make a green tomato chutney.
Oh, yes. Excellent.
Because, if I'm faced with hard frost coming, and yes, some of those tomatoes I'll be able to pick and I will ripen on the kitchen counter, but some of them really don't ripen that well. I'm not a fried green tomato fan. So green tomato chutney, and you can put zucchini in that. You can put apple chunks in that. You can mix it up with your garden produce when it comes to a chutney. And yes, I think raisins are always a great ingredient because they add that nice sweetness that counterbalances the vinegar and the spices.
Yeah, absolutely. The only thing that you can't mess around with when we're talking about pickles or chutneys is the acid level, because that's key to making a safe preserve. So if you are looking at an existing recipe and you have to adjust the amounts because you have more or less of the fruit that you're preserving, be sure you keep the proportions the same, because if you decrease the acidity percentage, you may not have a safe preserve. So that's really important to remember.
Well, I hope that our listeners do preserve some of their harvest and, send us a picture. plantrama@gmail.com. We'd love to see what you have preserved from your garden.
letter this week came from Morgan, who says, I work in landscaping and I always notice weeds trying to hide in other plants that they look very similar to. Is there any research to suggest that weeds do this intentionally? Now, CL and I are often heard to be marveling at the intricacies of nature and the things that seem unbelievable and yet occur. But when I heard this from Morgan, I thought, I have never seen that. I was a landscaper. I've never once seen that. And of course, CL dug into her research. And I think she's come up with a few examples that just leave me shaking my head in wonder and admiration.
Well, I absolutely relate to what Morgan wrote about, because not only working in the garden do I sometimes come across a plant. Well, maybe it might be a smartweed growing in with a summer phlox, for example, and the leaves are kind of similar, right? And so I'll suddenly realize that smartweed is bigger than the phlox, and I never spotted it for like the past 2 months.
Yeah.
I also saw that in the garden center, where when we were growing our own perennials, sometimes there would be a weed that would sneak into the pots. We'd be watering these pots assiduously. And suddenly, when it was time to take them out of the hoop house and price them up and put them on the display, I would realize that the majority of the pot was filled with a look-alike weed. So I get what Morgan was saying, but in those instances, I know it's just that they happened to grow there and I didn't notice them because they were similar, right? That a weed that started to grow in that pot or next to that phlox that was crabgrass, for example, or purslane, that I recognized right away when it was small. I'd pull it out, and I wouldn't think twice about it. But I did remember reading about a vine that was found in Chile and Argentina that has the ability to mimic the plants around it. Now, this is very rare in the plant world, right? It's common in the animal world. There is a name for it. It's called Crypsis, Crypsis. And this plant in Chile and Argentina has the ability to do that. It transforms its leaves to copy the tree that it's growing in. And so scientists in 2014 discovered this plant and were astonished because when they compared the leaves of the plant on the ground, this is, by the way, Bocchilia trifoliolata. It is a plant that when they compared what was growing on the ground, and then they would compare the leaves in one tree, it would be completely different, and they would be close to what that tree produced. And then when it grew in another tree, the leaves would be close to what grew in that tree. And so this is a rare example where, yes, plants do this.
I am amazed by that, and I'm sure there's got to be some evolutionary advantage that this gives that plant. I'm not sure what it is, but I can imagine a bunch of different possibilities. But as you said, this is rare. This is not something that happens in everybody's garden or everybody's garden center. So what Morgan is noticing, my guess is more likely what you described in the beginning. It's a weed that just happens to look like the neighboring plant, and we haven't noticed it yet. No insult intended, Morgan. I'm sure you have an eagle eye. But if you're not writing to us from Brazil or Argentina, it seems like you may not have one of these chameleon plants.
There are also, Ellen, varieties of mistletoe in Australia that do the same thing.
Okay.
Yes. And they do say that the advantage to this is that it's a defense against plant-eating herbivores. So it is a defense that way. And apparently they think that these vines read cues that are hidden in the odors and the pheromones and the microbes that their host plants are giving out. and they adapt themselves accordingly. And so they may even be producing those pheromones of that host tree to disguise themselves
Wow.
against insects that would normally be eating them.
It makes you reassess your definition of intelligence.
And frankly, Morgan, I would not be surprised if at some point we discovered that maybe somehow those seeds of those look-alike plants do tend to somehow germinate more actively under their look-alike. I don't know. But I'm going to keep an eye out for new research because we are always finding out amazing things about the plant world.
If you have a question that we could answer on a future podcast, please send it to us at plantrama@gmail.com.
And until we're with you next time, remember to grow great things, protect wild places, and play in the dirt.